Good evening and welcome to our Journey of Hope event featuring two amazing authors and individuals, Jason Rosenthal and Paris Rosenthal. I am Michelle Premack, a proud board member of the Chicago chapter of the Israel Cancer Research Fund, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this event. To begin, I would like to thank our host committee members and our generous sponsors for helping to make this event such a great success. Before we hear from our speakers who personally understand the importance of cancer research and will share their own experiences of loss and hope, please allow me one moment to tell you a little bit about ICRF and why this organization speaks to me. ICRF is an international nonprofit and is the largest source of private funds for cancer research in Israel. For 46 years, ICRF has successfully supported brilliant scientists conducting groundbreaking cancer research in Israel. Being that we have no affiliation with any institution in Israel, we are able to entertain proposals from scientists regardless of their affiliation, allowing for the best grant proposals to reach us. When proposals are submitted, they are graded impartially by a volunteer panel of North American leading physicians and scientist experts. Many of our scientists have received top awards for their discoveries. We are most proud that we continue to support scientists who play key roles in the development of 3 FDA-approved breakthrough drugs, Gleevec and Velcade for blood cancer, and Doxil for solid tumor cancers. The 2 lead scientists in these developments shared Israel's first Nobel Prizes in chemistry, and to this day credit ICRF for believing in them and giving them their early funding. As a breast cancer survivor, these kinds of discoveries are undeniably the reason I became involved with ICRF. I want to make sure others do not have to experience the pain and suffering I went through when I was diagnosed. Israel holds the key to help eliminate the suffering of cancer. There are many institutions working on cancer research. However, if you are like me and you love Israel and the desire to have your investment make its biggest impact on cancer, then your choice is clear. Continue to support and get involved with this wonderful organization. Again, thank you for being with us tonight. Now I will turn this over to my fellow board members, Jill Kirschenbaum and Rebecca Raff, who will introduce both of our speakers.
Thank you all, and hello, good evening. I'm Jill Kirschenbaum. It's my pleasure to introduce Jason Rosenthal. Jason became a popular celebrity when his late wife, Amy Krouse Rosenthal, wrote the article that went viral, "You May Want to Marry My Husband." But truth be known, Jason is famous in his own right. He's the #1 New York Times bestselling author of Dear Boy, co-written with his daughter, Paris. He resides as a board chair of the Amy Krouse Rosenthal Foundation, which supports childhood literacy and early detection research of ovarian cancer. He's a lawyer, a public speaker, and most importantly, a devoted father of 3. And tonight, we are honored to have Jason talk about what inspired him to write his latest book, My Wife Said You May Want to Marry Me, as well as share his personal account of life, love, hope, and new beginnings, respecting Amy's wish. Jason is passionate about helping others find ways to fill their blank spaces as he continues to fill his own. And Jason, we are all looking forward to hearing about your journey. And now I want to hand it over to Rebecca Raff to introduce Paris Rosenthal.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Raff, and I'm so excited to introduce Paris Rosenthal. Paris is a bright young woman who followed in her mother's footsteps as a wonderful author of a variety of popular books, including the #1 New York Times bestseller, Dear Girl, which she co-authored with her mom. As you just heard, Paris co-authored with her dad the #1 New York Times bestseller, Dear Boy. And she also wrote Dear Baby, Dear Teacher, and Project 123, which are all must-reads. Paris currently lives in New York City. And yes, as she so often gets asked, she is named after the city Paris. Tonight will be an interactive event. Please type your questions into the chat and Jason and Paris will answer them during the second half of our evening. Again, thank you so much for joining us, Jason and Paris, and I will now turn the screens over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having us here this evening. And thank you to the Israel Cancer Research Fund and to Jill for that nice introduction, and to Allison and Michelle and everyone working behind the scenes to make this event happen. To your host committee, many familiar names. I hope you're out there, and hello if you know who we are. And the other familiar faces that I see on the screen tonight. Thank you for being here. We were supposed to be with you in person over a year ago, which is an amazing thing to say. But here we are in a virtual capacity, and we're really delighted to share this evening with you. Before I go into what I want to talk about specifically, I do want to acknowledge this really difficult year that all of us have been through. I come from a place of having a real devastating loss in my life, and somehow finding the resilience to continue forward. And I know many of us this year have experienced tremendous loss, whether it's your normal routines or not seeing your family for literally a year. That kind of stuff is so hard. It could have been a financial setback, or God forbid, some of you like us have lost someone close to you during this year of COVID and this pandemic. And if that's you and that's your experience, I just want to say from my own seat here that there will be a tremendous amount of anxiety as you move forward, and maybe a little bit of joy after that, and then stepping back into some really anxious periods of time. And if that's your experience, please know that that's normal and that's okay, and it's just part of the grieving process as we move forward. So we're here to talk about a lot of things, but I have to start off this evening with a little bit of a lighter note. So let me do that real quick, if I can get my technology to work. Of course, it's May the 4th, so I had to do it. I'm sorry, forgive me. It's just one of those things. But we're here to talk about a few things. One of them is my book. It's a memoir called My Wife Said You May Want to Marry Me. And the story is really in three parts. The first part of my book is a story of love and family and joy. The second part of the book is really a difficult read. It talks a bit about what it's like to be with someone you love at the end of their life, and a little bit about how to communicate with someone who's going through the grieving process. And the third part of my book is really in line with this theme of your event tonight, and that is a journey of hope, and how in unexpected ways we find some resilience from the deepest depths of grief. And so let's talk a little bit about the story. Back in 1989, when a family friend of mine, who was also a family friend of Amy's, called me and said, there's this wonderful woman moving back from San Francisco to Chicago, and I think you guys would be compatible. Give her a call. So I took down her phone number, and of course I spelled her name wrong at the time, but eventually called her and went on my first and only blind date. Now, Amy famously says that at the end of that date, she knew she wanted to marry me. It took me a little bit of time, not too much, but as you can see from these photographs, we quickly became close, and you can see the joy and the love for each other on our faces. And eventually I did indeed know that I wanted to spend my life with this woman. And so I proposed to her in my dad's commercial film studio, setting it up as a Parisian scene. Paris was important to both of us for different reasons, with a red and white checkered tablecloth, pictures of Paris, French music playing, and of course a bottle of red wine. And I think you all know the answer. She did say yes. And it was immediately after our wedding, on our honeymoon even, that I got a sense of what it was like to really live with a writer. When on that honeymoon, we compiled a list, and we called it Amy and Jason Rosenthal's Marriage, Goals, and Ideas. A couple of them I just want to highlight. It wasn't a document that was kept on our fridge and that we stared at every day. In fact, I only rediscovered it as I began to write this book. But a couple I'll highlight and one of them is never stop learning. Take classes, read, cook, and travel. And boy, did we live by that. We traveled a lot individually together as a couple and as a family, both for fun and for social service. And this one has gotten a lot of feedback from readers, those who've been married for decades or just getting together, and that is to get dressed up and go on dates. And to me, that just meant to remember who you were before the chaos of life ensues. And for us, that chaos did start. And the product was these three wonderful human beings. 2 kids in diapers for 6 years. Yes, there was a lot of chaos, but spearheaded by Amy's whimsy and fun and creativity that we all sort of shared, we had some wonderful, wonderful moments together. And part 2 of the book is a tough read, but I think very important because it really, like I said, talks about my experience in going through the process of being with someone who you love at the end of their life. And it was literally when Paris went to college that we got the news that Amy had a diagnosis of late stage ovarian cancer. And of course, that news shattered our world, rocked our world, and changed the trajectory of all of our lives from that moment forward. Many of you know Amy. I see a lot of familiar faces for the wonderful human being that she was. But others of you around the country or around the world may just know her from an essay that appeared in the Modern Love column of the New York Times on March 3rd of 2017, 10 days before she died of ovarian cancer. And that essay was brilliant. It was beautifully written. It was so raw and honest. And of course, because Amy wrote it, it was funny, even in that stage of her life. And I think that's why it really resonated with so many millions and millions of people all over the world. And like I said, it cast me into a spotlight because it was a creative play on a personal ad for me and made me this sort of public figure that I never anticipated, didn't ask for, and couldn't ever have anticipated. But there it was. And here we are in part 3 of the book. And I wanted to include this quote because, you know, I talked about this quote in my eulogy for Amy at her memorial service. The quote says, "Hope is an ability to work for something because it's good, not just because it stands a chance to succeed." And I really thought that resonated for us and our family, and for Amy, because she was a creative force and extremely successful as a writer. But a great deal of her creativity came from doing community projects and making short films and doing talks, TED Talks and other talks that were just part of her DNA that she had to put out into the world. And I asked the boys when they were little what they thought about Amy's writing and her creativity. And if you could turn up your volume a little bit for this next part. Whoops, let's go back one slide.
I think she's a very good writer. And I think it's pretty interesting that she's wrote almost 5 books, 500. She's an amazing writer.
She was an amazing writer. It's so true, and they're both accurate. She wrote somewhere between 5 and 500 books and many other creative projects. And so shortly after losing Amy, I began to try to discover that hope by finding my speaking voice and my writing voice. And, you know, immediately after she died, I was approached by all kinds of media asking me salacious details about whether I was dating and am I getting married, literally weeks after losing her. But I had no interest, and I was so enmeshed in the deep depths of grief that I, of course, didn't do that. But when the folks at TED called and said, "Would you like to convey your story on the main TED stage in Vancouver?" I thought that was an opportunity for me to really talk to people in a raw way, in a deep way, about the grieving process and about an experience that so many people around the world have that I just didn't hear about. And that is what it's really like to be with someone at the end of their life, and a little bit about the grieving process. And it was immediately after that speech that I was approached by many people thanking me for sharing my story. And it gave me motivation to continue to talk about these things. Loss and grief, sure, but also about that hope and resilience. And that's what I did for the next few years before the pandemic hit. And I began to grapple with some very deep issues that I'm sure many of you who go through grief also think about. And I love this quote because it says we need to find a way to talk about both things, the reality of deep, persistent pain and the reality of living with that pain in a way that is gentle, authentic, and even beautiful. I think that says a lot. And I also wrote a modern love column of my own called My Wife Said You May Want to Marry Me. Yes, it did give me a platform to expand it into the book that we've been talking about. And of course, as was said in the introduction, I had the tremendous honor of writing this book, Dear Boy, with our co-keynote speaker, Paris Rosenthal, my daughter. As part of my process of emerging with a sense of hope, I knew that I wanted to commission a piece of public art for Amy. And I hope you'll come visit if you're in Chicago or if you visit Chicago. It's a large yellow umbrella with a beautiful glass top that sits in Lincoln Park. Come read a book, contemplate, meditate, throw a dance party, whatever you think, but come visit it. And of course, my journey of hope is really cemented by my experience with these incredible human beings, my 3 children who I'm not just single parenting, but they're teaching me so much as well. And so there it is, that proverbial blank page, even 4 years later, that I am continuing to author. And if it is your position as well, please know that there will, of course, be a tremendous amount of darkness, but try to find that light. And I was so interested to read this quote by a Holocaust survivor, Edith Eger. And she said, "You can't heal what you don't feel." And to me, that's so true. Grief has no timetable. And if it's sitting in grief for a great deal of time, then sit there and feel it. And then try to find that joy, because loss can take you to joy and loss can take you to beauty. And speaking of beauty, one of the most beautiful human beings that I know, not just physically, as you'll see, but deep down in her soul, I'd like to turn it over now to my daughter, Paris Rosenthal.
Thank you, Dad. Just gonna share my screen. That was great. And let's get right into my journey of hope. Oh. This is where I went to school, Quest University, Canada. Such a magical place. One of the aspects that lured me in was the fact that students get the opportunity to create their own majors. But they're not really majors because they're in the form of a question. When it was time to start crafting my question, my mom had recently been diagnosed with ovarian cancer. Her illness and the concept of death were at the forefront of my mind. Rather, I was entirely consumed by it. I couldn't think of anything that was worth devoting my time to more than these topics. So my question became, how do we address death? I studied how different cultures around the world deal with death, and I was on a mission to understand why so many people in Western society have such a hard time talking about it. For my senior thesis project, I wrote a memoir about the journey of losing my mom and about our rich relationship. In that process, I found myself returning to the idea that we can't truly discuss the meaning of life without discussing the meaning of death. Furthermore, if you love, you will inevitably grieve. There's a beautiful, simple quote I read recently in an article about the show WandaVision, and it says, "What is grief if not love persevering?" I love this. When my mom got sick and eventually passed away, my instinct was to dive deeper into the topics of death and loss. Fortunately, I had family members who were willing to join me in that space of curiosity and open communication, especially my immediate family, my 2 older brothers, and my dad. Since I'm here today with my dad, I'll speak to our relationship in particular. But I want to acknowledge how great my brothers have been as well. After my mom died, my dad and I never intentionally set out to deal with our grief in such similar ways. Rather, it happened naturally. We both wanted to talk about death, about grief, about resilience, about really our shared human experience. Because of that, our bond grew stronger and stronger. Now I try to embrace the fact that there are things that my dad and I talk about and do together on a daily basis that weren't really part of our dynamic before. I wrote an article that was published in Modern Loss about this very concept. If you don't know the website Modern Loss, I encourage you to check it out. Not only did our relationship change after my mom passed away, but my perspective on life changed in many ways. In ways that I think push me to live a more humble, aware, and present life. I'll share a few of them with you in hopes that some resonate. Number 1 is my sense of time. I really don't like to waste it, and I like to think of it as one of the most precious things there is. Whenever I say goodbye to someone, I hug them extra tighter because I never know when it might be the last time. Author, philosopher, and neuroscientist Sam Harris says it well. Each time you do something, pleasant or unpleasant, that is one less time that you'll do it. There will come a time when you'll have done something the final time, and you'll rarely know when that is. Everything represents a finite opportunity to savor your life. Number 2 is saying yes. In the last several years, I found myself saying yes more than I ever had to new opportunities, especially when they challenged me. Sometimes it's absolutely necessary to say no, don't get me wrong. But maybe if your instinct is to say no, say yes next time and see what happens, see where it leads you. Life is indeed short. Plus, over the past year, we've heard the word no way too much, so this idea of saying yes is all the more timely. And number 3 is gratitude. As cliche as it may sound, I try to take moments throughout the day to reflect on all that I do have rather than what I don't have. It can be as simple as writing down 3 things I'm grateful for each day. I also make an effort to express gratitude to the people in my life and tell them how much I love them and appreciate them often. I'm not always perfect at executing these things that I just mentioned. It is a constant work in progress. But for me, these new perspectives are very intertwined to the idea of hope. Author David Kessler says that there's a 6th stage of grief in addition to the 5 main ones that you might know. And the 6th stage is finding meaning. He goes on to say that we have the false idea that our work is to make grief smaller. Our work is to become bigger and grow around the grief. Meaning occurs in the small moments. Maybe you become a more generous person. Maybe you become a more determined person. Maybe you become a kinder person. So if I can face tragedy and come out the other side as a better person, that gives me hope. I've also found hope in my career. In publishing 5 books over the past 4 or so years. I've found hope in my yoga practice, in therapy sessions for sure, in seeing live music. I've found hope in books, in being in love, in nature. I've found hope in connecting with other people and with their stories of loss. After this year, it is safe to say, as my dad mentioned, that we've all experienced loss in one form or another. So in this way, we're connected more than ever. The title of this event sums it up perfectly. Hope is a journey. Thank you all for being part of my journey by being here tonight, and I wish you the best of luck on your own life journey. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Amy. Oh my God, I'm sorry. Thank you so much, Jason and Paris. I'm going to start the questions. We already have several questions. To both of you, where were the first places you traveled to after Amy passed, and how was the experience?
Well, I'm pretty sure my first travel experience was something that I write about actually in the book, which was something that became known as the Heal Jason Tour. And that was an experience that I went on a trip with my buddies to see some live music in Colorado. And that really, lifted me up and reminded me that, as a friend said very early on in the grieving process, that Jason, you will find joy. And that surely was a joyful and fun experience.
My answer to that question is I actually went on birthright. So I went to Israel a couple months after my mom died, which was kind of the perfect place to be, as I'm sure many of you listening have been to Israel. It's a very spiritual and magical place. And I went with a couple of my oldest and best friends. And then basically right after that, I studied abroad in Amsterdam. So I guess I was traveling around a little bit after our loss, which was challenging in many ways and helpful in other ways.
Thank you. And what would Amy be thinking if she heard your talk tonight?
Oh, that's a tough one to say. I think that Amy was known to be a cheerleader for everybody that she loved, especially in her family, and even for strangers that she didn't know. She was just that kind of a, kind person. And I think that she would be certainly excited to see her beautiful daughter be able to express herself so articulately and beautifully and intelligently, no matter what she was doing, whether it was this topic or something else.
And I think that leads great into the next question. To Paris, what inspired you to write children's books?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I got into writing children's books because of her, that is for sure. She really led the way for me in writing our book, Dear Girl, together. That's how I got into writing children's books. I was so honored when she asked me to write this book with her. And from there, I wrote the book with my dad, and then felt ready to kind of write a couple books on my own. But as I said, it really did start with her.
And when someone is grieving, what is something constructive that we can do for him or her? I hate saying, let me know if there is something, if there is something I can do for you. That puts the onus on the grieving person.
I could take a stab at that. I think that the main thing that I tell people when they ask me that question is really sounds so simple, but it's really powerful. And that is to just communicate the fact that you are thinking about that person and that you care, and that you're there for them. And that just goes a very, very long way, because you're right. Many people don't know what to say, when to say it, or how to say it. It is very difficult. There's no question about it. But I think coming from a place of empathy and compassion, by really just saying that you don't know what to say, but that you want to be there for them is really important. And I think that's accurate what the person who asked that question said. I was asked many times, hey, let's go out and get a beer. And, in the first few months or whatever, or the first timeline of deep grief. And that's true. It puts the onus on the person who's grieving. That will never be successful. So, a specific invitation at a specific time, if you're close within that circle, do that. And if the person who's grieving doesn't want to at that time, that's okay. They'll tell you, just try again and keep trying.
Paris, anything different for you since you were a lot younger?
I was just going to say that I think there's a great part in my dad's book that basically answers this question, and gives some tips on what to say and what to do. So that was like the first thing I thought of. So just encouraging everyone to read his book.
And what was the trajectory when you would get together with the couples you used to do things with as a couple? And as time went on, did that change?
I'm assuming that's for me.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it's a good question. I put myself into some positions that I thought I was ready for, and I write about this too in the book, that I thought, okay, let's just, I'm just going to go do these things. One of which was attending a friend's child's wedding. And it was way too early, and it was not a great idea. And that was sort of a disaster. But, I think moving forward, there was a bit of awkwardness, but those friends who stayed in contact with me were not just, Amy's friends, they were our friends. And so I wanted to maintain those relationships in my life. And that's what I did.
And what is the significance of the yellow umbrella?
Well, the yellow umbrella has become Amy's legacy symbol, but the origin of it was that she made a short film, just throwing it out there to the universe, saying that the last thing that she was going to do was to create this community project with everyone. And I would encourage people to go check it out on YouTube. It's called The Beckoning of Lovely. And she indicated that she would be the one entering Millennium Park, which is here in Chicago, carrying the yellow umbrella. And she had no idea what to expect or who was going to attend. But sure enough, when she walked into the park holding this yellow umbrella, there were hundreds and hundreds of people there. And it was a beautiful event that she orchestrated that evening. And that was sort of the origin of it.
And how much did Paris, you and your mom, and Jason, you and Amy, talk about her health, her death, her wishes for you all, aside from the article?
We definitely talked about it a lot. As I said earlier, I think our whole family was pretty open to having these hard conversations. And I think that's a combination of just being fortunate, but also effort. I know that that's not just the case for everyone. And I feel very grateful that we did have a lot of conversations about her death while she was still alive. And I wrote this in my eulogy to her, but I remember vividly when she was pretty sick, I was asking her, something like a bunch of questions about what should I do in X, Y, and Z situation, like when you're not here, which in and of itself I couldn't believe I was having these conversations. But she was like, let's talk about it now. Let's map it out. and she was just totally willing to have these conversations, which in a way felt like normal at the time, but thinking about it now, it's just pretty surreal. But yeah, we had conversations like that just on walks, and those were really helpful, and I still think of them often.
Having some time really causes you to reflect on some deep esoteric questions, but also some practical questions. So Amy and I spoke all the time, and some of those were in the dark recesses of a hospital room or here in the house when she was extremely ill. But I'm so grateful for the time that I had to be with her and to talk to her about lots of things that I was thinking about. First and foremost, how the heck was I going to do this parenting role all by myself, because she was so connected to each one of the kids in such a unique and special way as only a mom can. And she assured me that that was true, but that I also had a wonderful relationship with each one of the kids and that I was going to be okay. And not all of us are going to have that kind of time, to have those kinds of conversations. So I have encouraged people as I continue to talk to communities around the world to have the conversations that you might not think of, but have them early when you're young and when you can communicate and when you're healthy. And I do provide some of those topics that I think are important in my book as well.
And what is your favorite book that Amy wrote? I guess that's to each of you.
I go first. Well, my favorite children's book is perhaps Little P, because that book started as a bedtime story for me, and it ended up being dedicated to me, so it's definitely a special one and was one of her very first. And then both of her memoirs are also in my favorites list.
It's the toughest question that I get. It's hard. How do you choose? But I was talking to my mother-in-law the other day, and it's interesting to go back and reread Amy's children's books, because they're just picture books, right? But they're so deep in a way that adults can appreciate it, and children certainly do. But if I was asked to just pick one book and sit with it and read it, I think it would be Encyclopedia of an Ordinary Life, which is a memoir that she wrote that is just so unique and so Amy. It's very deep and philosophical, but it's also really, really, really funny in parts. And it's a wonderful read.
In Paris, teens and young adults who have been struggling this past year could really benefit from your message of hope. Do you write, or have you thought about writing for that audience?
For what audience exactly?
I guess other teens and young adults who have been just struggling in general.
I don't know if I'm necessarily, an expert. As I said, I definitely still have my own struggles, especially this past year. So that's the honest answer. But yeah, I mean, I'm always writing, but not necessarily for a direct audience. But maybe I'll think about it now that I had that question. Thank you.
And what new family traditions have you started since Amy passed?
What new family traditions? Is that what you said?
Yes. What new family traditions?
Well, I think it's more about, it's an interesting question and a good question. I would be curious what Paris would say about that. I think it's been really a little bit of a challenge because we're physically all over the place, but we've tried to maintain the tradition of, before COVID, of traveling together as a unit, the four of us. And when everyone's home, having our Shabbat dinners and things like that. But we will continue to make new memories together every time that we are together as a foursome.
Paris, your mom would love your books. somebody wrote, and you have a great sense of empathy. Please write for teenagers. So that's what somebody added in the chat.
Thank you.
Somebody else just wrote, Paris, tell us more about your career, what's next for you, and any guidance for young women and men your age at finding their voice.
So my newest book, Dear Teacher, came out recently. And if it's not clear by now, it's part of a series of 4 books. And Dear Teacher is actually the last book in this series. So I'm kind of trying to figure out the answer to that question, actually, and figuring out what is next. Maybe something else entirely, different children's book. But yeah, what I can say is that it is the last book in this series. And as for advice, what was the question? Advice about
for guidance for young women and men your age at finding their voice.
Finding their voice. Well, I think that's something I struggled with and have only like recently become better at. So it's definitely a process and one like a continuous process. But I think you can find your voice in a lot of different ways. And for me, I, gravitated towards writing and like always have. I've been writing since I was little and like found that as a great outlet for me to really develop my voice. But I think you can find your voice in a lot of different ways.
And how are the boys doing?
Paris, what do you think?
I think I saw one of them a couple days ago. He's doing well. I think they're doing pretty well. What do you think, Dad?
I think they're doing wonderfully well. It's been a difficult year for, like I said at the beginning, for everyone. But they're doing what they should be doing. They're starting their young lives. They're working really hard. They're finding some joy and enjoyment, spending time with family. Yeah, and they're doing great. They're amazing young men.
That's great. Somebody wrote, we read Little P every night before bedtime for so many years. We have many others that we love. We are so grateful for the love that Amy's books brought to my children's bedtime routine. So I just wanted to share that note. Here's another question. Did you find comfort from any Jewish rituals regarding grief and mourning? If so, which ones?
Well, I know Paris can answer that probably about her experience in Israel, and maybe something else. But I would say, for the most part, I've been asked that a lot, and my faith is deep and a big part of who I am. But to be honest with you, a lot of those issues were really called into question when a person as wonderful and kind and beautiful and giving as Amy was taken from us so early. So I would say it's more maintaining the traditions that we established. And, we were guided beautifully by a cantor at our temple during the time that we were creating our service. And she was fabulous in sitting with every one of our family members. But it's a struggle that I continue with, I would say.
And I have a question for you on a lighter note. What are you most looking forward to as things are opening up, and especially any concerts or music bands that you're interested in seeing?
Yeah, going back to a show with my daughter would be like amazing. That we have a history of seeing live music together. It's a deep passion of both of ours, and I think it's one of the biggest things I've missed this year, no question.
I agree with that wholeheartedly.
And what kind of music? Anything in particular?
Paris?
I think I give credit to you in saying that I think I have a pretty wide range of music that I like. Pop, rock, like rap, everything. So at this point I would take anything, honestly.
Amen. I would say the same.
And then somebody did ask if there's, Jason, has anyone answered Amy's article?
Well, I mean, I got many responses, specifically from women. I got a lot of responses from incredibly wonderful people all over the world, giving me support, giving my family support. And yes, I got a lot of responses from women, but not from that essay, but I'm in a meaningful relationship and I'm very happy.
And somebody else wrote in, so impressed with both of you. I read Amy's New York Times article and was so impressed with her. May you continue on your journey of hope.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think that's a great segue. I think, I guess the final question is if you can leave us with your last words of hope. Any last words?
Well, I'm hopeful that in the near future that if the opportunity arises that we can see each other somehow in person and give each other a hug or a high five or a fist bump, because I really do miss seeing communities like yours in person and listening to your stories in addition to telling my own.
Great. So I'm going to turn it over to Lee Katz.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. I'm Lee Katz. I'm co-chair of this moving and beautiful evening. First, I'd like to say a heartfelt thank you to Jason and Paris for sharing your story with us. We're really, truly appreciative. I'd also once again like to thank our dedicated host committee and generous event sponsors for helping make this evening so successful. And now it's time to announce our raffle prize winners. Our first prize is a dozen yellow roses delivered the day before Mother's Day to the person of your choice. We chose yellow in Amy's honor. And the winner is Jana Burke. Our second prize is 4 signed books by our wonderful authors, Jason and Paris. We'll be in touch tomorrow to make arrangements for receiving your prizes. And our lucky winner is Nancy Taxman. Actually, tonight we are all winners because we had the opportunity to hear the inspiring journey of hope from Jason and Paris. To each of you, because of your participation and generosity, our scientists will continue their research, giving cancer patients their journey of hope. If you enjoyed this evening, please consider additional support by visiting our website, www.icrfonline.org, because the answer to cancer is research. Again, our sincere thanks for joining us tonight. Have a wonderful evening.